Hello, I'm Summerlin Brown, the daughter of J.J. Brown and Rita J. I got my first name from my aunt on my mom's side, and I got my middle and last name from my grandpa, Robert Lynn Brown. I like that I get to carry his name. My dad, J.J., is the youngest of Grandma Jennie Hadlocks and Grandpa Robert L. Brown's kids, and he was born in Baghdad, Iraq. And I'm the youngest of all of their grandchildren. My dad says that Grandma and Grandpa hit the jackpot with their oldest child, Rob Brown, and by the time it got to him, things sort of fell apart. And then they hit the jackpot again with the oldest grandkid, Robert Kai, and it only got better and better with every grandkid. Did I mention that I'm the youngest of all the grandkids? I'll let you do the math on that one. I had a school assignment about immigration, and we were supposed to find out where our ancestors first came to America. My dad taught me about family search, and we figured out who the first immigrants were on his side. We started out with Grandpa Brown's line and went back to Sir William Brown, who was a knight. He was titled Baron Brown of Snelton and was the governor of Flushing. He was my 12th great-grandfather. Queen Elizabeth I was queen when he was born, and Sir Brown was about 26 when William Shakespeare was born. William married Mary Ann Hall in 1581 in Suffolk, England. The wedding was held at St. Andrew's Parish Church in Wingfield, Suffolk. And it's amazing to me that when you look at these sites in England, they are still in use, and the small town still looks a lot like they did back then. When William Brown married Mary Hall, it was still 20 years before John Smith landed in America to meet Pocahontas and established the first English settlement, Jamestown in Virginia. So people in England hadn't started even thinking about making the dangerous journey to become a part of the American colonies yet, and my favorite Broadway, Hamilton, hadn't even been written yet. So that's Grandpa Brown's direct lineage going back to England, which makes it ours too. Now for Grandma Jennie, her maiden name was Hadlock, and when we go up her direct lineage, things get interesting. She's even a direct descendant of Susan North Martin, a famous victim of the Salem witch trials. If you are a descendant of Jennie Hadlock, then you carry Susan North Martin's blood in your veins, but that's for a different video. When we go up Jennie Hadlock's direct lineage, we discover that during the same time that William Brown lived, William Hadlock was also alive. So through both lines, we all had a direct great-grandpa, William Brown, living at the same time as a William Hadlock. But they also lived in the same place, Suffolk, at the same time. Just 2 years before William Brown married Anne Hall at St. Andrew's Church, William Hadlock married Susan Carter just 22 miles away at St. Mary's Church. Notice on the video how these little hamlets and churches have hardly changed at all over the years. If you take away the cars and telephone poles, they are basically the same as they've always been. Turns out that my 10th and 12th great-grandfather lived a lot closer together in the 1500s than my grandparents did growing up. And they were a lot closer together in those days than when the first Brown and the first Hadlock settled in Utah. Then these two Williams had grandsons named James. And James Brown and James Hadlock both joined the Massachusetts Bay Company and came to Salem, Massachusetts as some of the very earliest English immigrants. In other words, our two lines began in the same country in England, but then ended up in the same city an ocean away. Salem was not that large, so they for sure knew each other in Salem, for sure, especially when they found out they were from the same county back in England. James Brown and James Hadlock got married 5 years apart and died in Salem within 11 years of each other. James Hadlock had a son, also named James, who married Abigail Martin in Salem. Abigail was the daughter of Susan North Martin, the victim of the witch trials, and that makes Susan North Martin my 8th great-grandmother. That goes for all of you. About 6 generations later, my 4th great-grandpa, Samuel Brown, and my 3rd great-grandfather, Archibald Hadlock, were both born in New Hampshire, 73 miles from each other. Samuel Brown was baptized into the LDS Church in 1831, and Archibald was baptized 10 years later in 1841. Archibald was a blacksmith in New Hampshire when Jeremiah Hatch came as an LDS missionary and converted him. The people of the town had organized a mob to come and attack Archibald and his family for being Mormon, but he was warned and he literally grabbed a few belongings and his family, ran to the train station and escaped. Some years later, missionaries came back to the town and converted the rest of the family to the LDS Church, but only one of that group ever came to Utah. Archibald came to Ogden, Utah by train, lived in northeast Utah, and eventually settled in Vernal with a blacksmith shop. That makes sense since his missionary Jeremiah Hatch was one of the first settlers of that area. Senator Orrin Hatch, who was my dad's boss, was a direct descendant of Jeremiah Hatch. Samuel Brown had also been in New Hampshire, as I just mentioned. His young wife had just died giving birth to his first child when the LDS missionaries showed up. He joined the church and fairly quickly left for Kirtland, Ohio. The Saints were threatened with extermination in Kirtland, so Samuel moved to Nauvoo and left with the Saints, and then Brigham Young asked him to settle in Payson, Utah. These two men began just 73 miles from each other in New Hampshire. They probably never met, but both joined the church and eventually ended up in Utah. When Archibald finally settled up in Vernal, Utah, he was 150 miles away from Samuel, who had settled in Payson. Isn't it strange that the two Robert and Jennie bloodlines lived a lot further away from each other once they were both in Utah than at any other time all the way back in the 1500s? And then by the time Bobby L. Brown and Jennie Hadlock were born, their bloodlines had moved even further apart. Jennie had taken every dance class offered at the University of Utah, and we should be glad that they wouldn't let her take them over again, because that made her retire her University of Utah cheerleading sweater and move to BYU when she met Bobby Brown. Somehow, Farmer Brown and dancer Jennie ended up in Baghdad, where my dad was born. He married Ann Chain and then Rita J, and ended up with 7 kids: Anthony, Audra, Lauren, Tara, Jaden, Kennedy, and me. And that's the story of how Summer Brown got to be born in the USA.